This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field like doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Elizabeth Hamilton, who teaches art history and African American studies at Fort Valley State University. Her work is broadly engaged with African diasporic art practices, ranging from the vernacular to Afrofuturism, and she is the author of Charting the Afrofuturist Imaginary in African American Art and the forthcoming Figuring It Out, Black Womanhood Through the Figurative in Alison Saar's Oeuvre, a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies. In this discussion, we explore the place of Black study sensibilities in art history, the politics of art and art criticism, and the significance of vernacular culture forms for understanding Black life. Good morning, Elizabeth. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. A little cold. We are recording this in the middle of a cold snap. I don't need to tell you that in Georgia, where we were just talking. You all are iced in. We had frozen pipes this morning, so I feel like I'm genuinely living the winter deep freeze lifestyle. But I'm really glad that we have this chance to talk today and get you in this podcast series. You know, your work is really interesting. I love getting work about art history into this podcast series because I think that is such a central part of Black studies and such a central part of the field. And so having you as part of that sort of cadre of art historians and artists is really important. So thank you for making the time today. I really look forward to this conversation.
You're welcome.
So before we get into specific questions about sort of your thoughts on Black studies, your thoughts on your research in relation to the history of the field, I wanted to really start with a more personal question, or a question about your own journey, which is to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? How do you see those things in relation to your journey as a thinker in person, of course, but also what sustained you in relation to the study of Black life and to the field of Black studies in your own way?
Well, I actually started as an artist. From the time I was a little girl, I always thought I would be a visual artist and I would be making art and making paintings, and that's what I really wanted to do. But when I got to undergrad, I went to undergrad at the University of Wyoming, and I earned my BFA there in studio art. I realized that I really didn't have the passion for art making that I had for the study of art. So in my junior year, I had an opportunity to do the McNair Scholars Program, which is a program that feeds underrepresented first-generation Black students, students from all backgrounds who are first-generation, into the pipeline to become PhDs. So that was my first encounter with researching. And I had a little bit of kind of background, doing my own research, because as a studio major, we're required to take art history classes. But during those classes, I found that the canon of art history is just so white. It was just so exclusionary of Black life, Black art. And then when I asked my professor about this, and I said, how come we're not covering, this artist or that artist? She said that there wasn't enough time to cover these artists, and, they're not really a part of the established canon, so we're not going to be covering them. And if you want to research that, you can on your own and write a paper about it. But she really didn't give me any direction about where to go. So I was pretty much on my own trying to figure out, how to understand Black life within art history, how to understand Black studies within art history. And that led me on my path to getting my PhD in art history, specializing in African American art. So it really was about me, coming to this point of discovery and trying to understand, what it was about, what Black life really represented within the field of art history.
Yeah, that phrase, that we don't have time for it, is so interesting. I mean, it's, I don't know what you call it, but it's like racial hegemony's great excuse. We don't have time, as well as, I mean, the other thing that you said, which is also a centerpiece, it's not a part of the established canon. And that's, I mean, for me, that's one of the things that's been so interesting about working in Black studies is never having to ask those kinds of questions, right? Never having to ask, like, is there time for this, right? Because the time is only the time of Black studies and Black study.
Right.
I'm curious, well, first of all, are you from out West?
No. My husband is actually in the Air Force. So we ended up in Wyoming with a duty assignment. So I ended up doing my undergrad there. But I'm originally from New Jersey.
Okay. I was wondering, I'm from out West, and so I was like, well, University of Wyoming, that's not just I mean, it is a kind of random place to end up if you're from New Jersey, so that makes sense. But I'm curious, when you started to do work in Black art, in art history, if you discovered anything about your own art practice. I know you said that you didn't really have the passion for it, but was it sort of like what you were looking for in art history gave you, or was it like something that you wanted more from than you could get from your art, but you were sort of seeking the same questions or the same issues and same expression?
Yes, definitely. So my artistic practice pretty much focused on self-portraits. So I was, doing this large body of work that focused on my own image. So I wanted to look at Black women who had also done that type of work. So I was looking at Alison Saar, I was looking at Renee Cox. I was looking at different artists like Lorraine O'Grady, who were working on portraits of Black women and what they were saying about the Black female body, and just how they were representing it. I was a non-traditional student. I was a mom. I was married, and I really didn't fit in with a lot of my classmates. So I found that the literature was where I found the most kind of just kind of information and just kind of camaraderie with these artists who I didn't even know. So I found a lot of my artistic practice came from looking at those specific artists, specifically Renee Cox. She was just gracious enough to give me an interview when I was an undergrad at the University of Wyoming. So I got to interview her for a project that I did for my research project for the McNair Scholars Program. She was amazing. Talking about her process really informed my own art making. And especially when thinking about the fraught history of the Black female body and what it came to represent, and those histories of pseudoscience, and just trying to wrest the Black female body from those kind of narratives and create something different.
That's amazing. I mean, I love Renee Cox's work. I mean, when you started to, it's funny because when you said that about self-portrait, and wrestling with what that meant, and sort of, that generational question, or however you want to think about it, as you said, not really fitting in with a sort of, 18 to 22 party centric undergraduate. Renee Cox was somebody who came to mind, right? I mean, I know, about the kind of things you work on. So, but that's amazing. You got an interview and everything. Yeah. And you mentioned Lorraine O'Grady, because I always like to, when it's relevant, mention other podcasts in the series. Stephanie Sparling Williams was one of our early podcasts, who wrote that book on Lorraine O'Grady, who, rest in peace, passed away just not that long ago. So, okay. So let me ask you then a little bit about Black studies. The field of Black studies, and I know your primary field is art history, but it's just so the kind of stuff you're interested in is also so central to the field of Black studies. But the origins of the field are, in this particular moment in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where the Black intellectual and expressive traditions really had no place in traditional disciplines. And so the demand for Black studies was really a demand for that kind of study, for those traditions to be available to study, to reproduce, to extend, to examine, and all of that. But it also came at that time where post-civil rights, Black liberation struggle had really contested some of our habits around the distinction between a campus and a community, between study and radical activism. And so it has, in some ways, at its origin, a competing demand, one for an intellectual and expressive tradition to be developed in terms of study, classrooms, and scholarship, but also a prescriptive demand about, what does study have to do with the concrete struggle and radicalized struggle for the liberation of Black people. And I think that tension is still present in the field. And so I'm interested, when you think of Black studies, how do you imagine the field broadly, but also in sort of in reference or in the context of that origin story?
Well, I just think of it as just being so expansive because with Black studies, I can move seamlessly from film to literature, music, and back to visual art. And being able to understand Black life through those lenses is something that I really appreciate about Black studies. But I think that because it is rooted in activism, that you can't actually wrest it from those origins, and you have to continue to understand it as being part of that struggle. And there's always going to be this idea about recovery and discovery and understanding it as a way of kind of like survival. So Black studies really does have a lot of benefits for the study of art history when we think of it as a way of recovering these artists who aren't a part of the canon, who need to be placed within that canon, not just as, a kind of marginalized figure, but made central to it, especially when we think of African-American art. We can't have African-American art, American art in general, without talking about the contributions of Black artists. So understanding that Black studies is just central to making sure that the whole story, the more inclusive story of our history is told, is just central to, what Black studies is about. And I really see it, especially now when we're talking about these bans on histories and on the ways that we teach. Even at Fort Valley, I teach at an HBCU, but I haven't been shielded from, being asked and surveyed if I teach divisive concepts. So yes, it has been a part of, what's happening here in Georgia. And those questions, I responded in the negative, but, I continue to make sure that Black studies is central to what I do. Because without it, my students aren't engaged. They don't see themselves in the curriculum. They don't want to participate. There's this inaudible groan every time I focused on, art that doesn't really relate to what they're interested in. So Black studies has been central to me keeping my students engaged, making sure that they understand what their contributions are in reference to a long line of other Black artists. I teach in a very small department at an HBCU. It's a visual and performing arts department, but it also includes liberal studies, languages, English, and we only have one art historian. That's me. And it's an interesting job to be the only person who focuses on, the history of art at a school. So I take my job very seriously, in that respect.
I mean, it's a really interesting response, really great response. And it does remind me, use the phrase divisive concepts, which I think at some point it's going to be a headline of a chapter of American history from this era. The discussion, I don't even know what we're going to call it, but the very idea of divisive concepts makes it difficult in some ways for me to ask this question about the origin of Black studies having this conflict around radical political activism, sort of in the streets, in the campus quad and everywhere in between, or the classroom and study, right? Because I just think we've entered a moment, I don't think we have, you just articulated how we are in a moment where the very idea of teaching this material is itself considered a radical act. I mean, the decadence of even that conflict between study and activism, I think, has just fizzled out overnight. I mean, I don't know how much it was there before. I think it was always, that's part of what we're learning, is how provocative just the study of Black life is to white Americans. So I think it's more of a discovery, but I will admit to being surprised at the way that distinction has collapsed so clearly. And happening at an HBCU, it's a completely fascinating, fascinating is the word I'll use, and just leave it at that. A fascinating turn of events. I won't press you on it because it's your workplace, but yeah, I've wondered how long until HBCUs are divisive concepts. And I'm talking to you from Maryland, home of many public HBCUs, and so this is our new horizon. But I also, it's interesting also to think about the place of art and art history to political thinking and political liberation struggle. I think that's, that's such an important part, not just of art and expressive culture generally, but also of your own particular, interests in Afrofuturism. And so, I'm interested in how thinking about, Afrofuturism, about cultural studies and art history the way you do, how you think of your work in relation to the history of the field of Black Studies, 50-something years. So where do you think it fits in that field, in that history? But also, what new horizons do you think it opens up? I mean, in some ways, just that word Afrofuturism is a new horizon opening up. But I'm curious how you see your work opening horizons, but also connecting to a tradition.
Well, I remember the first time I read In Search of the Black Fantastic by Richard Eiton, and how totally deflated I was when he made the statement that Black art spaces don't really have the political investments of other types of Black popular culture because they are separated from traditional type of kind of grassroots artistic spaces such as music and television and movies, but kind of having visual art and these museum spaces and galleries is kind of separated from Black life. And I was so deflated because as an art historian, he's basically saying that what I do doesn't have any political investment. So that kind of really took me aback and made me think about the ways that there's always this bind in art history where, we're seen as being kind of too highbrow to make a real kind of effect on what is happening within the lives and within the communities of Black people. Somehow we're separated. Somehow we're too elitist. It's seen, I think Kehinde Wiley is the artist who said that he makes luxury objects for a certain type of clientele, and seeing those art objects as a luxury object really separates it from being, as effective as we want it to be. So when I think of my place within art history, I think it is to try to make it a place where we can look at art, and look for art in certain places that are more vernacular. Looking at quilts, looking at old photographs. And there has been some work done. Emily Boone's new book on Vanderzee, as well as Lisa Gail Collins' book on her new book on quilts. They look at these vernacular spaces where art history can live, and make it more relevant to what Black African American art history can be, and really taking it to spaces that have long been ignored. So I really think that is the space that art history needs to go. Really beginning to look at these vernacular spaces as valuable and understanding them as places that have been traditionally ignored that need the attention now.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, the word or the concept, whatever you want to call it, of vernacular is really central to my own research and thinking. Mm-hmm. And I just, one of the things among many that it underscores is, these are not, there's the luxury object, right? Mm-hmm. I happen to own a Kehinde Wiley basketball, right? I understand, these things he sells for X number of dollars that support artists who go to, Dakar or wherever the the artist colony retreat that he runs is. But I understand that, but that as a broad claim by whether it's by Eitan or Wiley or whomever else about Black art being detached from communities and community mobilization does always strike me as strange because of exactly what you said. The vernacular of Black life is so deeply connected and so profoundly impacted by expressive traditions. I mean, if nothing else, white Americans have always feared the contagion of that. That's whether it's Elvis Presley or race records and, all of these things. So in finding public spaces for that and thinking about museum spaces, how do you see that translating? There's the idea of something that's not the Met, right? Community gallery space. But also those bigger gallery spaces, which are increasingly contested spaces, and there are these interventions. How do you imagine or think about the politics of that between what you might call vernacular galleries and national galleries?
Well, what's happening right now in Montgomery, Alabama is really exciting with Brian Stevenson's legacy sites. And the sculpture park, that outdoor sculpture park is amazing. So bringing art into a space, and he pretty much has a few acres of land where there are outdoor sculptures, and you just walk the land and you interact with these beautiful works of art by Hank Willis Thompson, Alison Saar, among many others. Artworks that are just so beautiful and just reveal so much about African American history. So it's a space of reckoning the legacy sites, but it's also a space that Black art can be just put in the place to really encounter the masses. It's meant to be interactive. He doesn't allow photographs within the space except for the Simone Lee that's right at the beginning. You can take a photograph with Brickhouse, but the rest of the space is pretty much off limits for photographs. And Simone Lee, speaking of Simone Lee, she has done some interesting work and taking her artwork outside of those gallery spaces. You'll see her work just in encounters in public art spaces that have pretty much made the art object something that everyday people can have an encounter with. And also she has had a project in which she opened a clinic to service Black women as well. So her art doesn't just, it isn't just about the visual. It's also about this activist kind of way of understanding Black life and really interacting with it and filling a need. And then also Alison Saar, bringing her art into kind of vernacular spaces is also her kind of partnering with the print shop and releasing her prints with Evie Shockley as a broadside. So making her artwork accessible to the masses in ways that Charles White and Elizabeth Catlett did in the 60s. Just understanding that Black art needs to be a part of everybody's life and making it, financially accessible, but also accessible in ways that everybody can see it. And I think social media also has a place in this as well, because I follow Simone Lee and Alison Saar on Instagram, and being able to see and interact with their work on those platforms has been, a revelation in my own research and seeing what they're working on daily. But just making sure that their artwork becomes a part of daily life and not just seen in these kind of elitist spaces.
I love that. I mean, part of the path that can be so part of the way the path of luxury object or divorce from political struggle, one of the paths that can go down, I think, is really quickly thinking that people aren't interested in being surrounded by art. Whereas if we actually think politically in the broadest sense, not just political like policy demands or economic justice demands, but also the way we live with one another, right? What it means to coexist. The atmospheric art space, right? The mural, as you said, the Stevenson, and all of these. So, hopefully everybody listening to this will be like hitting Google to find everything that you're talking about if they don't already know, because I think thinking that way about the everydayness of art as an atmosphere that makes us politically different, not in terms of reporting policy, right? But in terms of making Black life present. So that that moment that you were talking about in your own education, where professor says, we don't have time for that. And when you walk through it, on your way to, the grocery store, to work, out for a walk, or as a trip, right? A day trip. Now we're talking about your everydayness being saturated with a whole different sense of time and what it means to be in the presence of art. I love this. It's interesting too to think about social media's relation to that. I mean, social media has become, and just really in some ways in the last month, so much intensified around its right-wing solidification and so forth. But I appreciate that reminder that it's also opening up access to all of these things that are potentially really transformative. Do your students already know about this, or is this something that you're able to put them into contact with? The social media context of these art places?
No, my students usually don't know anything about them. So when I have them write a visual analysis of an artwork for art appreciation, and I leave it open to interpretation, for them to choose any artist they want. And they usually don't know any of the artists like that I'm talking about. So we spend the first few weeks talking about different artists and introducing them, to, how you can access these artists' works and things like that. But they usually don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's why teaching is, changing people's lives. If they already knew everything, they wouldn't need us. But that's wonderful. And hopefully they pass it on to, beyond their own classrooms as well. So let me ask, in some ways, this is connected to exactly this moment that you're talking about, or that I asked you about, the classroom and your students. Your doctoral work, as you said, was in a Department of Art History, which is in some ways a disciplinary education. But I also know that in other ways, it's very multidisciplinary, especially when you get outside the sort of European canon studies. But your work was in art history, and then your research and interests are so embedded in Black studies. And I'm interested in thinking about that trajectory through a discipline, which is kind of a discipline, but also engagement and embeddedness in this field of multidisciplinary or non-disciplinary study called Black Studies. How you think that's impacted your research and thinking, but also how it impacts how you think about and construct a classroom?
Well, it's definitely made me just really just think of the world in more expansive ways, because art history is just necessarily, I think, exclusive. There are gatekeepers who make sure and maintain boundaries. Keeping those boundaries up, has been a part of the process of art history. But Black Studies is expansive and makes sure that there are ways into the canon, not just amending it, but also just trying to recreate it, tear it down, and make it into something else. And I think that's the work of Black Studies. So understanding my work, as an art historian, I can't do it without Black Studies, because I'm looking at the lives and the art of Black people and understanding what their lives were like, understanding these artists' lives and the things that affected them, the things that impact them. They have totally different paths that we talk about as far as a traditional artist, and then being able to look at their archives and just understanding their lives. We really have to look at it through the lens of Black Studies. There aren't these typical ways that we can look at, when Giorgio Vasari wrote Lives of Artists, he was looking at these kind of great artistic traditions and trying to, create these genealogies. But Black people don't necessarily have those genealogies because of the violent discontinuity of slavery. So understanding that we have to look in these places that aren't typically understood as being kind of scholarly, or, so we have to look in these kind of places that that aren't necessarily understood as, being the most highbrow, and being able to look in those places and not look down on them. So that has really affected my work and made, the study of African American art history more expansive. Black studies makes everything more expansive.
And how do you think, in terms of the art history classroom, that plays out?
Oh, that plays out definitely with a culturally responsive pedagogy. My students, as I mentioned before, there is this inaudible groan because this semester I am teaching Art History Survey 1, and it focuses on prehistory until the Gothic period. And my students find it so boring. So I have to find ways to keep them engaged, and making sure that I include artistic traditions that are kind of pushed out. We use a text called Gardner's Art Through the Ages. That's the book that I was taught from. So that's the book that I teach with now. And it is the text, I think, lacks in, looking at artistic traditions that aren't a part of the West. And I have to find ways to make sure that my students see themselves in the curriculum. So making sure that they stay engaged throughout the process has been my main job to tackle as a professor at an HBCU. Because when they don't see themselves in the curriculum, I just lose them. I mean, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, you can literally see their eyes glaze over as we start talking about, these artistic traditions that see them as less than, where they're pictured in these artworks as servants, as kind of, these auxiliary figures and not as central. So I make sure that they're able to write about an artwork or an artist who, engages, their own culture and their own history.
Yeah. I'll have to look that book up. I may have also learned art history from that book.
Okay.
Is it an old book, like from
Yes.
the 80s? Okay.
Yes.
Because I think Art Through the Ages, I mean, not that this is about me, but I always wanted to be an art historian as an undergraduate, but I'm colorblind, and you just really can't do a lot of art history as a colorblind person. So, but it's funny, I had not thought of that book for a very, very long time. But, when you say that about teaching at an HBCU and that moment of not seeing themselves, it does remind me. I mean, I teach at University of Maryland, which is obviously not an HBCU. It's a PWI, but teaching in an Africana Studies department, I have this experience every time I teach Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. I have them read some of Jean-Paul Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew. And I have that same moment with them where they're just like, why? Why are we doing this? And I was like, well, it's an interesting discussion. How is race and racism being thought here in a way that's both inside Europe and not communicable across colonialism? They're just like, yeah, can we get to Fanon? But also getting them to see, as you were saying, what does it mean if that's the servant on the edge? How do we think about that? That's a question you can make careers out of. People have made careers out of asking questions from those edges. But well, let me ask you this: a big question about the field of Black Studies. What do you think that Black Studies has done well, and what do you think Black Studies has not done particularly well?
Well, I think that the thing that Black Studies has done particularly well is making sure that it meets the pedagogical need of Black students, making sure that we see ourselves centered within a scholastic understanding, has been the major kind of benefit of Black Studies, decentering whiteness and making sure that our stories are understood and they're told. That has been done very well. As far as something that hasn't been done as well is making sure that some of the knowledge that we understand as canonical can come from these kind of places that aren't seen as particularly scholarly. We have to learn to look in sources that aren't necessarily kind of accepted. We have to vet them ourselves. Like sometimes I think the book that I think of when I'm considering this is Nicole Fleetwood's Troubling Vision, when she talks about Teenie Harris's body of work and those portraits that he was taking. And some of those are seen kind of as, lowbrow. And they're not really seen as kind of fine art, but she takes it and she discusses it in a way that places it within the art historical canon. And I think when we begin to look at these sources that can be kind of seen as not as scholarly, we can kind of, open up new doors and new pathways in Black studies.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think about that exact question all the time. I'm especially I'm like really happy to have those, exactly what you said on this podcast series. But I think a lot about that question in terms of some of the actual canonical figures or commonly taught and studied figures and how they thought about their sources. Mm-hmm. If you take like James Baldwin or Angela Davis, right? So two thinkers who are particularly dear to me. So that's why I bring them up. But for both of them, like somebody like Bessie Smith, is more important even than Du Bois or Washington, right? They don't look to what is immediately recognizable as a scholarly resource. But instead, Baldwin says when he goes into exile, he says, all I needed was my Bessie Smith records and my typewriter to know that I'm an American. Mm-hmm. Right. And I teach a seminar regularly on just a single figure course on Angela Davis and spend so much time with her Blues Legacies book. And she's just basically making a series of reflections there on Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith that says all of the work Angela Davis had done before in the 70s and 80s in some ways is just coming from what these blues women were doing. Right. So it's like the sources of our sources are often this vernacular root. But what would it mean for us to look back at that?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think art history is like the art historical sort of wing, if you want to call it, of Black studies is particularly suited to that? Or do you think it's just as much a struggle in sort of the area that you work in?
It has been a constant struggle, I think, in trying to get art history to get away from its elitist kind of orientation and away from the idea that these are luxury objects, and to look at Black life in a way that can be kind of gleaned for sources that are art historical as well. John Vlatch does amazing work on craft histories and trying to place craft history within, these art historical traditions. And I think more work needs to be done continually to make sure that we're broadening what we think of and what we consider in our historical source.
And the politics of that, to get back to the sort of opening couple questions about, the political meaning of our work in Black studies, I think the politics of that are just so powerful. To think about another podcast from inside the series, Mark Anthony Neal, in the conversation I had with him, he really emphasized this about, the politics of Black studies or cultural politics of Black studies is often articulated in terms of, we need to make our work accessible to everyday Black people so they could read our articles and books. And he's like, that's fine, that's great. But let's also return the question to ourselves of, how much of our work is actually responding to or embedded in the lives of everyday Black people.
Right.
Right. Those everyday art practices, those everyday expressive practices, language, movement, politics, culture, etc. Right. And so that political dimension of what you just said I think that's just so potent. But it puts it sort of uncomfortably at our doorstep because it requires a whole other kind of thinking from us rather than, you should make it accessible to more people, which is a writing question. I mean, when people say that to me, I'm always like, I'm trying my best to be a good writer. It's hard to write. But the things that we study and the things that we talk about as intellectually important, as you said, I mean, the politics of that it's a hard one to dislodge. Yeah. So you got to write this book that makes this clear to all of us, and we all have to respond to it. No pressure. Well, let me ask you a sort of futurist question about the field of Black studies. And this is a question that is prompted for me by a remark that Richard Wright makes at the end of his essay, The Literature of the American Negro, where he says, he says, people ask me, when are you going, you, meaning Black writers, going to stop talking about race? And he says, well, you will know when there is no more racism when we stop talking about race. In other words, once white people stop subjugating and terrorizing Black people, we won't need Black literature, right? And being Richard Wright, we all know that's snarky. He doesn't think this is even an imaginable possibility. But to sort of take that, so what that sort of raises for me when I think about the field of Black studies is this question of what would be the sign of the success of Black studies in the future? Would it be to have so transformed disciplines, art history, philosophy, history, sociology, psychology, etc., so that all those disciplines study Black life as a centerpiece of what they do rather than one professor who teaches one course a year, right? But really making the study of Black life central to disciplines. And in that way, the sign of our success in Black studies would be to no longer need to exist. Or do you think there's something about Black studies that is so distinctive that its index of its success in the future will be its irreplaceability?
I actually think it's the latter, because Black studies will always have power and utility, and there will always be a need for there to be a distinct type of area of study just for that of Black life. And to make it central within that space, as well as other spaces, speaks to its power and utility. And I think that especially, with the inauguration that just happened on Monday, and thinking about the onslaught of executive orders that have been going through, and the ways that the Trump administration is trying to get rid of anything that has to do with DEI or anything that has to do, with Black life, just almost as if they're trying to erase it, just shows that there is power and there is utility to Black studies, and we have to make sure that it continues to thrive. And there has to be a way to make sure that we preserve it in ways that under attack, it still functions. And that I don't necessarily see us having to go underground, but I do see us having to defend ourselves more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, I believe executive orders have withdrawn the equal opportunity protections. That's a radical move. But also one that's consistent with the history of this country, right? And therefore, I mean, it's interesting when you say, maybe there's Black studies that, what does that mean in terms of going underground? Underground, of course, being a historically really important metaphor and reality. But, I think that's, the way you put that really crystallizes, for me at least, this crossroads paradox, I don't know what to call it exactly, of Black studies, which is we have to remain at some level undigestible so that we don't get absorbed by these other disciplines.
Right.
But in being undigestible, I mean, what happens when something's undigestible, right? The body tries to expel it, right? And so what does it mean to risk expulsion by being undigestible, but that being a way of preserving who and what we are? I think, the way you put that, that's our puzzle for 4 years, but many more than 4 years, because this stuff takes a long time to be upended and course corrected. And so maybe in terms of my final question, maybe in some ways you've already spoken to this, but I'll ask it directly anyway. Thinking in the context of Black studies and Black study, what is the issue you think we should all be thinking about? What is the question you think we should all be asking?
I think we should all be asking ourselves how we can make Black studies relevant to the public in ways that when they see it under attack, they can see it as something that's a false narrative and see it for the kind of, I guess, almost an attack that is unwarranted. There seems to be so much fear behind, what happens when we teach Black studies. There just seems to be this fear that somehow there is an accusatory kind of way of, making white people feel guilty about the past. But if we get people, I think, to understand and kind of ask themselves the question, what do we have to benefit from Black studies? And what ways can it benefit all people, not just Black people, but it can benefit all people, and getting people to understand the past and what can be garnered from our survival techniques, from our thriving, and how it can be applied to all Americans, not just Black Americans. So beginning to question that.
I really love that. It's as you put it, it's like building in the response to the accusation. So we're not always on the defensive or always having to re-explain ourselves. I really love that. I hope people hear that question and take it really seriously, because that's not a task that's taken up by an individual or an organization. It's something that's taken up by all of us in our own particular ways. And I really appreciate you putting it exactly that way. That puts it right at our, our doorstep to think about and figure out, how do we play a productive relation to that? Because if we don't play a productive relation to that, we play defense all the time. And we don't have any people to rally immediately to our side. I mean, that's always my biggest fear. Like, who are our allies? And you really put it out there directly. Like, this is how you get built-in allies. Already have that answer for people. So, yeah, I mean, this whole conversation's been extremely interesting and really thoughtful, which I appreciate. But this last bit from you, this is going to stick with me. So I'm really moved by that. I really thank you for it. And really, thank you for your time. This has been fantastic. I was looking forward to it. And I loved hearing your thoughts. And this is an excellent contribution to our series.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right.
Bye-bye.